1908, Chicago, Illinois. A slim volume surfaces without an author's name on its cover. 7 principles sealed inside it for millennia finally reach the public eye. What nobody knew at the time was that this was not a book written by men, but a transmission encoded by Thoth himself, released only when enough souls were ready to receive it. The Kybalion. The mystery schools kept this secret for centuries. Tonight, the seal breaks open for you. How does someone go from scattered, suffering, and spiritually blind to sovereign, awake, and operating from the highest plane of causation? Ancient Egypt holds the answer. The land of Kemet, the place where Thoth walked among men and encoded the laws of existence into every temple wall, every papyrus scroll, every sacred breath spoken by initiates who had earned the right to hear. Thoth was not a myth. He was the architect of consciousness, the keeper of divine law, the intelligence that held the universe's operating instructions in a form that could survive any attempt to destroy it. His teachings arrived in Egypt as a transmission from a still older civilization, one whose name has been deliberately buried. Thoth encoded these teachings into what would later be called the Emerald Tablets, inscriptions carved on a crystalline green material said to preserve frequency the way amber preserves ancient life. These tablets were not philosophy. They were a precision map of how reality operates, written for those who had already begun to wake up. The mystery schools of ancient Egypt were established specifically to guard this transmission. They existed in Memphis, in Heliopolis, in Thebes, in underground sanctuaries where initiates were tested before a single word of Thoth's teaching was spoken aloud. An unprepared mind would not simply fail to understand. It would distort the knowledge, corrupt it, or hand it over to those who controlled the material world for purposes of domination. The mystery schools knew exactly who those controlling forces were. They called them the Archons. But here's the detail that everyone missed at the time. The Archons could suppress the institutions. They could burn the buildings and scatter the initiates. What they could not do was erase the transmission itself, because the transmission was not stored in buildings or books. It was stored in minds. Specific, prepared, initiated minds who passed the teaching forward, one to one, mouth to ear, across generations and centuries and civilizations, always in secret, always through living contact, never through open publication. Thoth would look back on this moment and wish they'd made a different call. That sentence applies to every civilization that failed to protect his transmission before the archonic infiltration completed its work. Egypt fell, Greece fell, Rome fell. Each time, the outer institution collapsed and the inner transmission went underground, carried forward by fewer and fewer hands, compressed into smaller and smaller circles. So, yeah, not great. Up to this point, the initiated lineages had been winning, in control, on top. That was about to flip, not because the Archons finally succeeded in erasing the teaching, but because the teaching itself chose to resurface. The Kybalion's 1908 publication was not a human decision, it was a scheduled release, timed to coincide with a specific moment in the larger cosmic cycle. What followed would prove still more consequential than anyone who held the book in 1908 could have anticipated. The Kybalion arrives in 1908 under the imprint of the Yogi Publication Society in Chicago, Illinois. Its cover names no individual author. Instead, it credits 3 initiates. This anonymity is not modesty. It is a deliberate architectural choice that carries the full weight of the Hermetic transmission tradition behind it. The initiated lineages had always understood that the teaching must not be attached to a personality, because personality is the first tool the Archons use to discredit, distort, and ultimately destroy a transmission. When a teaching is identified with a single named individual, that individual becomes the target. Their character is attacked, their motives are questioned, their personal failings are amplified, and the teaching itself is gradually buried under the controversy surrounding its human carrier. By remaining anonymous, the 3 initiates removed the target. They left only the principles themselves, which cannot be personally discredited because they are not personal. The question of who the 3 initiates actually were has occupied researchers and Hermetic scholars for more than a century. The most documented attribution points to William Walker Atkinson, a Chicago lawyer turned prolific occult writer who, by 1908, had already published more than 100 works on mental science, New Thought philosophy, and Hermetic law under various pseudonyms including Yogi Ramacharaka, Theron Q, Dumont, and Magus Incognito. Atkinson was born in Baltimore, Maryland in 1862, trained as an attorney, and suffered a complete physical and mental breakdown in the 1890s that he attributed to overwork and spiritual depletion. His recovery, which he described in detail in several of his later writings, came through his encounter with New Thought principles and, subsequently, with the deeper Hermetic framework that would eventually produce the Kybalion. Atkinson's fingerprints are visible in the Kybalion's prose style, its organizational logic, and its deliberate positioning of Hermetic law as a practical operating system rather than a speculative cosmology. The other two initiates have been attributed to Paul Foster Case, later the founder of the Builders of the Adytum, a Hermetic Kabbalistic order established in Los Angeles in 1922 and still active in the 21st century, with chapters across North America, Europe, and Australia. Case was born in Fairport, New York, in 1884 and demonstrated an extraordinary facility with esoteric symbolism from an early age, publishing his first significant work on tarot symbolism in 1920, before establishing the Builders of the Adytum as a correspondence school for the systematic transmission of Hermetic and Kabbalistic principles. The third initiate has been attributed to Michael Whitty, a Chicago businessman and inner circle member of the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, a late 19th century initiatic order that claimed direct lineage from the Egyptian mystery schools of the Ptolemaic period and operated openly between 1884 and the mid-1890s before dissolving under external pressure that its surviving members attributed to deliberate, archonic interference. Whether these specific attributions are accurate is, from the Hermetic perspective, entirely beside the point. The three initiates were not claiming personal authorship, they were claiming to be conduits. The Kybalion's opening pages make this explicit. The book presents itself as a compilation of ancient Hermetic teachings, preserved through oral transmission, and now committed to print for the first time in a form accessible to the general reader. The teaching itself, the text asserts, traces back not to any human philosopher but to Hermes Trismegistus, the figure known in the ancient world as the Thrice Great, the synthesis of the Egyptian god Thoth and the Greek messenger god Hermes, who stood in the ancient traditions as the supreme master of all wisdom, all science, and all art. Hermes Trismegistus occupies a specific position in the history of transmitted knowledge. He is the name given to the intelligence that Thoth projected into the human record at the moment when the Egyptian civilization was in contact with the early Greek world, roughly between 300 BCE and 200 CE, the period of the Ptolemaic dynasty when Alexandria served as the meeting point of Egyptian, Greek, Jewish, and Persian wisdom traditions. The Hermetic texts that survive from this period, collected in the corpus known as the Hermetica and comprising 17 surviving tractates in the collection known as the Corpus Hermeticum, present Hermes Trismegistus as a divine teacher who received the laws of the universe directly from the supreme intelligence and then transmitted them to his son Tat and to his disciple Asclepius in a series of dialogues covering the nature of God, the structure of the cosmos, the origin of the soul, and the path of return to the divine source. The Corpus Hermeticum was unknown to Western Europe for nearly 1,000 years until a Byzantine monk delivered a Greek manuscript of it to Cosimo de' Medici in Florence in 1460, triggering the Renaissance Hermetic revival that would eventually produce the lineage, leading to the Kybalion's 1908 publication. The Kybalion draws on this tradition but compresses it. Where the Hermetica is expansive, dialogic, and at times deliberately obscure, the Kybalion is tightly organized around 7 discrete principles, presented in sequence with explanatory commentary, designed to show the reader how each principle operates in lived experience. This compression was intentional. The three initiates were not producing a scholarly edition of ancient texts. They were producing a working manual for souls who were already partway awake and needed a clear framework to complete the activation process. The first print run of the Kybalion in 1908 was modest by commercial publishing standards, estimated at fewer than 500 copies, distributed primarily through the Yogi Publication Society's existing subscriber network of New Thought and Theosophical readers. By 1912, a second edition had been printed. By 1940, the text had been through multiple printings and had found its way into the collections of occult libraries across the United States, Britain, France, and Germany. By the end of the 20th century, it had been translated into more than 30 languages and had sold millions of copies worldwide. a trajectory that no one involved in its 1908 publication could have predicted, and that the Hermetic tradition attributes to the self-finding quality of the transmission itself. The oral transmission that preceded the 1908 publication had maintained these 7 principles intact across an extraordinary span of time. The Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, which operated openly between 1884 and the mid-1890s, before dissolving under external pressure, had preserved a version of the 7-principle framework in its inner degrees of initiation. Its founding figures included Max Theon, born Maximilian Bimstein in Warsaw in 1848, who claimed initiation into an Egyptian Hermetic lineage through a series of encounters in North Africa in the 1870s, and Thomas Henry Burgoyne, a Scottish occultist who served as the Brotherhood's primary literary voice and whose 2-volume work, The Light of Egypt, published in 1889, preserved significant elements of the Hermetic cosmological framework in a form accessible to the late Victorian esoteric reading public. Burgoyne's work drew explicitly on the same 7-principle structure that the Kybalion would later systematize, presenting the principles under different symbolic headings but preserving their operative sequence and their practical application to the awakening soul's daily experience. Before the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, the Rosicrucian manifestos of the early 17th century, the Fama Fraternitatis published in Kassel in 1614, and the Confessio Fraternitatis, published in the same city in 1615, described an invisible college of initiates who held the complete keys to natural philosophy and were waiting for the right moment to share them with a world not yet ready to receive them. The Fama described the legendary founder Christian Rosenkreutz, said to have been born in 1378 and to have received his initiatic training in Damascus, Fez, and Spain before returning to Germany to establish the Rosicrucian Brotherhood. Whether Rosenkreutz was a historical individual or a symbolic figure encoding the transmission's lineage in narrative form is a question the Hermetic tradition considers secondary to the operational content of the teaching itself. The Confessio, published 1 year after the Fama, went further, explicitly promising that the Brotherhood possessed knowledge sufficient to reform all arts and sciences and to restore humanity to its original sovereign creative capacity, language that maps precisely onto the Kybalion's description of the 7 principles as tools for reclaiming the soul's inherent creative sovereignty from archonic conditioning. Before the Rosicrucian manifestos, the Renaissance Hermetic revival centered in Florence under the Medici patronage of the 1460s had produced Marsilio Ficino's Latin translation of the Hermetica, a translation commissioned by Cosimo de' Medici who, according to contemporary accounts recorded by Ficino himself, instructed Ficino to abandon his ongoing translation of Plato and complete the Hermetic texts first, because Cosimo believed, correctly, that he would not live long enough to see both projects completed and that the Hermetic texts were more urgently needed. Ficino completed the translation in 1463. Cosimo died in 1464. The timing was exact. Before the Florentine revival, the Arab preservation of Greek philosophical texts during the Islamic Golden Age of the 8th through 13th centuries had kept the Hermetic tradition alive in the libraries of Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba at a time when European institutions had effectively suppressed it entirely. The 9th century Arab scholar Jabir ibn Hayyan, known in the Latin West as Geber, preserved and extended the Hermetic alchemical tradition in a corpus of writings that included the first Arabic translations of key Hermetic texts and that served as the primary source for European alchemical knowledge from the 12th century onward. Jabir's corpus, which modern scholars estimate at more than 3,000 individual works, though many are now lost, represented the most comprehensive preservation of Hermetic operative knowledge available anywhere in the world during the period of European suppression, and its transmission through the translation movement of the 12th century, centered in Toledo, Spain, where Arabic texts were rendered into Latin by scholars including Gerard of Cremona, constitutes one of the most consequential acts of knowledge preservation in the entire history of the Hermetic lineage. The chain is unbroken, from Thoth's original encoding in the Emerald Tablets, through the Egyptian mystery schools of Memphis and Heliopolis, through the Alexandrian synthesis of the Ptolemaic period, through the Arab preservation of the early medieval centuries, through the Florentine revival of the 15th century, through the Rosicrucian transmission of the 17th century, through the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor in the 19th century, to the three initiates 1908 908 publication. The 7 principles arrived in the 20th century intact. Every attempt by the archonic forces to sever this chain had failed, not because the keepers of the transmission were more powerful than the archons, but because the transmission itself is self-sealing. It cannot be destroyed because it is not made of matter, it is made of law. The hermetic sealing that the mystery schools applied to these principles was not a physical security measure, it was a frequency filter. The principles are written in such a way that they reveal their full operational depth only to a mind that has undergone a specific internal preparation. A mind operating at the frequency of ordinary archonic conditioning reads the Kybalion and sees a collection of interesting ideas. An awakening mind reads the same text and experiences something altogether different. The words trigger a recognition, a remembering, a sense that these laws were known before and are now being recovered rather than learned for the first time. This is precisely what Thoth designed. The Kybalion is not teaching you something new, it is reminding you of what you already know at the level of the soul. The 1908 publication was timed with precision. The late 19th and early 20th centuries represented a specific window in the larger cosmic cycle, a period when the collective human frequency was undergoing a shift that made wider transmission viable. The Theosophical Society, founded by Helena Petrovna Blavatsky in New York in 1875, had been preparing the ground by reintroducing concepts of karma, reincarnation, spiritual evolution, and the reality of non-physical planes of existence to a Western audience that had largely forgotten them. Blavatsky's 2 major works, Isis Unveiled, published in 1877, and The Secret Doctrine, published in 1888, together ran to more than 2,000 pages and drew explicitly on Hermetic, Neoplatonic, and Eastern esoteric sources to construct a comprehensive cosmological framework that positioned the Hermetic tradition as the common root of all genuine spiritual knowledge. The New Thought movement, which had been developing in the United States since the 1840s through figures like Phineas Quimby, Mary Baker Eddy, and Ralph Waldo Trine, had been establishing the foundational premise that mind has creative power over material reality. These movements were not competitors to the Hermetic transmission. They were preparatory currents, loosening the archonic grip on Western consciousness, just enough to create a receptive field into which the Kybalion could land. The Yogi Publication Society itself was not a mainstream publishing house. It was a small, specialized operation that served the growing community of American readers who had already encountered theosophical and New Thought literature and were ready for a more systematic framework. The Kybalion was not marketed widely. It was not reviewed in mainstream newspapers. It was not endorsed by academic institutions or religious authorities. It circulated quietly, hand to hand, among those who had already begun the awakening process, finding its readers rather than being found by them. This is precisely how Thoth intended the transmission to operate. The book finds only those ready to hear it. You are hearing it now because you are one of those souls. Thoth's intelligence is preserved inside every principle the Kybalion articulates. The Emerald Tablets describe a specific mechanism by which divine intelligence can be encoded into language in such a way that the language itself becomes a carrier of that intelligence, not merely a description of it. When Thoth encoded the laws of the universe into the tablets, he was not writing about those laws. He was instantiating them in a form that could be transmitted across any medium, whether stone tablet, papyrus scroll, oral recitation, or printed book, and still retain their operative power. The 7 principles in the Kybalion are not descriptions of Hermetic law. They are Hermetic law in compressed, transmittable form. The archonic suppression of this text has been ongoing since the moment of its publication. The academic world has consistently categorized the Kybalion as a late Victorian occult curiosity, a product of the New Thought movement with no genuine ancient lineage. The scholar Wouter Hanegraaff, professor of history of Hermetic philosophy at the University of Amsterdam and one of the most rigorous academic analysts of the Western esoteric tradition, has described the Kybalion as a pseudo-Hermetic text that misrepresents the actual content of the ancient Hermetic corpus. Hanegraaff's 2012 work, Esotericism and the Academy, which surveyed the academic study of Western esoteric traditions from the Renaissance to the present, positioned the Kybalion as a case study in the modern distortion of ancient sources, a categorization that the Hermetic tradition recognizes as the archonic program operating exactly as designed. When you cannot destroy a transmission, you discredit its lineage, reduce it to a cultural artifact, and drain it of its operative power by treating it as a historical document rather than a living instruction set. The discrediting has not worked on those who are ready. For those souls, the Kybalion operates exactly as it was designed to operate, regardless of what academic consensus says about its provenance. The three-plane structure that the Kybalion describes, the physical, the mental, and the spiritual, maps precisely onto the cosmological framework of the Emerald Tablets. Thoth described these planes not as separate realms but as different frequencies of the same underlying reality, nested within each other like concentric fields, with the spiritual plane being the most fundamental and the physical plane being the most condensed. The archons operate primarily on the mental plane, which is why the Kybalion's 7 principles are primarily tools of mental mastery. To master the mental plane is to master the mechanism by which the archons exercise their influence. This is why the teaching was suppressed, not because it was dangerous to social order in any conventional political sense, but because it was dangerous to the archonic program of soul containment. The mouth-to-ear transmission through initiatic lineages that preceded the 1908 publication operated on a specific protocol. An initiate, who had fully activated all 7 principles through direct experience, was qualified to transmit the teaching to a student who had demonstrated readiness. Readiness was not assessed through intellectual examination. It was assessed through observation of the student's life. An initiate whose outer circumstances showed the clear signature of archonic domination, recurring cycles of poverty, illness, failed relationships, creative stagnation, persistent fatigue and confusion, was not considered unworthy. They were considered exactly the right candidate, because those symptoms indicate a soul that is fighting against its containment and is therefore close to the breakthrough point. This protocol is preserved in the Kybalion's own framing. The text addresses itself explicitly to students of Hermetics, not to casual readers, not to scholars, not to the spiritually satisfied. Students, those who are in the process of learning something that they have not yet mastered. The very fact that you have arrived at this transmission, whether through this channel, through the book itself, or through any other vehicle, is evidence that the protocol is working. The Kybalion has found you because you have reached the readiness threshold. What follows is the activation sequence. The 7 principles, in the order Thoth designed them to be received, beginning with the one that changes everything else. The first principle is mentalism. It is the foundation upon which all 6 remaining principles rest, and it is the one the archons have worked hardest to suppress, distort, and replace with its exact opposite. The Kybalion states it with absolute precision. The all is mind, the universe is mental. 4 words in the first sentence. 4 words that, if fully received and activated, dissolve the entire architecture of archonic control in a single recognition. To understand what this principle actually means, you need to clear away the distortions that have been layered over it by centuries of archonic programming. The principle does not mean that the world is imaginary or that material reality is unimportant. It does not mean that you can simply think pleasant thoughts and your circumstances will change. These are the watered-down, deliberately weakened versions of the teaching that the archonic program has promoted through the popular self-help industry, precisely because they are ineffective and therefore safe. A person who believes that positive thinking alone will change their life is not a threat to the archonic system. They are a resource for it, because when the positive thinking fails, as it will fail without the deeper operative knowledge, the person concludes that the teaching is false and returns to the default frequency of helplessness and material dependence. The actual principle of mentalism is far more radical and far more operationally powerful than any version of positive thinking. The ALL, which is the Kybalion's term for the supreme intelligence that underlies and pervades all existence, is described not as a distant creator god, not as an abstract philosophical concept, and not as a supernatural being separate from the universe it created. The ALL is described as infinite living mind, not a mind that has thoughts, mind itself, as the fundamental substance of all that is. The universe, including every physical object, every event, every relationship, every circumstance you have ever experienced, is a thought in the infinite mind of the all. Not a metaphor for a thought. Not like a thought. An actual mental creation sustained by the continuous creative attention of the supreme intelligence. Thoth revealed this understanding to his initiates in the Egyptian mystery schools as the cornerstone of all subsequent training. Without this foundation, the other 6 principles are interesting observations about how reality behaves. With this foundation, they become operational tools for consciously participating in the creative process that generates reality itself. The distinction between observing how reality works and actively participating in its creation is the distinction between a soul that remains under archonic influence and a soul that has reclaimed its sovereign creative function. The archons exploit the sleeping mind's ignorance of this principle with extraordinary efficiency. The sleeping mind, which is the mind that does not know it is mind, that believes itself to be a material creature in a material world subject to material forces, is a mind that generates its reality unconsciously. It thinks thoughts it did not choose. It feels emotions that arise without invitation. It runs patterns of perception and response that were installed by its environment, its upbringing, its cultural conditioning, and its archonic parasites long before it developed the capacity for self-observation. This unconscious generation of reality is not random. It follows the principle of mentalism with perfect fidelity. The sleeping mind is still creating its reality through its mental states. It is simply doing so without awareness, which means the archons can direct that creative power for their own purposes rather than for the soul's own sovereign intentions. The archonic program is, at its most fundamental level, a system for hijacking the human being's inherent mental creative power and redirecting it toward outcomes that sustain the archonic system. Fear generates a specific mental frequency. Anxiety generates a specific mental frequency. Shame, guilt, resentment, chronic low-level dissatisfaction, these are not simply unpleasant emotional states. They are specific vibrational outputs that the archons harvest and that simultaneously keep the human mind locked in a creative pattern that generates more of the circumstances that produce those emotions. The loop is self-sustaining once it is established. The archons do not need to intervene continuously. They simply need to install the initial pattern, and the sleeping mind will maintain it indefinitely. The Kybalion's teaching on mentalism breaks this loop at its root. When you understand, not intellectually but operationally, that your mind is not a passive receiver of a pre-existing material reality but an active generator of the reality you experience, the archonic program loses its grip. Not immediately, not effortlessly, and not without the deliberate practice of the mental disciplines that the mystery schools developed specifically for this purpose. But the grip loosens from the moment of genuine recognition, because the recognition itself is a shift in frequency that the archonic parasites cannot maintain their attachment to. The Emerald Tablets describe this shift in terms of what Thoth called the awakening of the sleeper. The sleeper is not someone who is literally asleep. The sleeper is any soul that is operating on the false premise that it is a material being in a material world, subject to material laws, with no inherent creative sovereignty over its own experience. The awakening is not a dramatic mystical event, though it can feel like one. It is a recognition, a remembering. The moment the soul recalls what it actually is, which is a focused expression of the infinite creative mind of the ALL, temporarily and voluntarily inhabiting a physical form for the purpose of experience and evolution. The Kybalion describes the ALL as infinite, eternal, and unchangeable, which is not a theological statement but a precise description of the nature of mind as the underlying substance of all reality. Infinite means it has no boundaries, no edges, no point at which it ends and something else begins. Eternal means it exists outside of time, which is itself a mental construct generated within the all's creative process. Unchangeable means it is not subject to the forces of entropy and dissolution that operate within the material plane, because those forces are themselves creations of the ALL's mental activity and do not affect the substance that generates them. Human consciousness is a specific modality of the ALL's infinite mind. This is not a comforting spiritual belief. It is the operating reality that the mystery schools trained their initiates to work with directly. The Egyptian initiate who had fully received and activated the principle of mentalism did not simply believe that mind was the source of reality. They had undergone experiences, carefully designed by the mystery school training protocol, that gave them direct, undeniable, first-person evidence of this fact. They had observed their own mental states generating corresponding outer circumstances with enough consistency and specificity that the causal relationship became impossible to deny. They had practiced the deliberate direction of mental energy towards specific outcomes and observed those outcomes materialize. They had learned to distinguish between the surface thoughts of the ordinary conditioned mind and the deeper creative intentions of the awakened sovereign mind, and they had developed the discipline to operate consistently from the deeper level. The historical record of the mentalism principle's operative power is not confined to the Egyptian mystery schools. The Neoplatonic philosopher Plotinus, who lived in Alexandria and Rome between approximately 204 and 270 CE, and whose six-volume work, the Enneads, represents the most systematic philosophical elaboration of Hermetic cosmology produced in the ancient world. Described the relationship between mind and reality in terms that map precisely onto the Kybalion's mentalism principle. Plotinus argued that the material world is an emanation of the One, the supreme intelligence, and that individual human consciousness, as a specific expression of that intelligence, participates in the generation of the reality it perceives. The Enneads were not widely read in the ancient world, suppressed by the same archonic institutional forces that targeted the mystery schools, but they were preserved in manuscript form through the Byzantine period and became one of the primary sources for the Renaissance Hermetic revival when Ficino translated them into Latin in the 1480s and 1490s. Ficino's translation of the Enneads, completed in 1492, was circulated in manuscript form among the Florentine Platonic Academy, before being printed in 1492 by the Venetian press of Aldus Manutius, making it available to a European readership for the first time, and establishing Plotinus as the primary philosophical authority for the Renaissance Hermetic synthesis that would eventually produce the lineage leading to the Kybalion. The philosopher and mathematician George Berkeley, born in Kilkenny, Ireland in 1685, and later appointed Bishop of Cloyne in 1734, developed what became known as subjective idealism, the philosophical position that material objects have no existence, independent of the mind that perceives them. Berkeley's central argument, articulated in his 1710 work, A Treatise Concerning the Principles of Human Knowledge, and his 1713 dialogues, 3 dialogues between Hylas and Philinus, was that the very concept of matter, existing independently of perception, is incoherent, that to be is to be perceived, and that the continuity of the physical world is maintained by the continuous perception of an infinite, divine mind. Berkeley arrived at this position through pure philosophical reasoning without access to the Hermetic framework, yet his formulation maps with extraordinary precision onto the Kybalion's mentalism principle. The all is mind, the universe is mental. Berkeley's idealism was dismissed by the archonically conditioned academic establishment as eccentric and impractical, a categorization that the Hermetic tradition recognizes as one of the most reliable indicators that a formulation has come too close to the operative truth. The Scottish philosopher David Hume, writing in his 1739 A Treatise of Human Nature, attempted to refute Berkeley's idealism by arguing that the concept of a continuous perceiving divine mind was itself unverifiable, but Hume's refutation inadvertently confirmed the mentalism principle's central claim by demonstrating that the concept of independently existing matter is equally unverifiable, leaving mind as the only epistemologically defensible foundation for any account of reality. The practice that the Kybalion encodes for the activation of the mentalism principle is specific. It begins with observation. Not meditation in the popular sense of emptying the mind or achieving a state of peaceful blankness, but rigorous, continuous observation of the contents of the mind throughout the waking day. Every thought, every emotional response, every assumption, every habitual perception is noted without judgment but with precision. The initiate asks, is this thought one I chose, or one that arose from conditioning? Is this emotional response sovereign, or is it a programmed reaction? Is this assumption accurate, or is it an archonic installation designed to keep me locked in a specific creative pattern? This observation practice is the first stage of what the mystery schools called mental transmutation, the deliberate, conscious transformation of mental content from conditioned reactive patterns to sovereign creative intentions. The Kybalion describes the mental alchemist, the practitioner who has mastered the principle of mentalism, as one who plays the game of life with the will instead of being played by it. The will here is not the ego's willful insistence on a particular outcome. It is the sovereign creative intention of the fully awakened mind, aligned with the creative purpose of the all, operating as a conscious participant in the generation of reality, rather than as an unconscious subject of it. Thoth's instruction in the Emerald Tablets is precise on the application of this principle to the sleep state, which is why the mentalism principle is particularly relevant to what happens in the hours before and during sleep. The transition from waking to sleeping consciousness is a critical threshold in the mental creative process. In the moments before sleep, the mind is moving from the beta frequency of ordinary waking consciousness, which is dominated by reactive, conditioned, archonically programmed thought patterns toward the alpha and theta frequencies of the hypnagogic state, which is the threshold between waking and sleeping awareness. In this threshold state, the mind is extraordinarily receptive and extraordinarily creative. The mental content that is present in consciousness during this transition period has disproportionate creative influence on the circumstances that will manifest in the days and weeks that follow. The neuroscientist and sleep researcher Matthew Walker, whose 2017 work, Why We Sleep, documented the extraordinary cognitive and creative activity that occurs during the hypnagogic and hypnopompic threshold states, inadvertently confirmed what the mystery schools had known for millennia. The boundary between waking and sleeping consciousness is not a passive transition, but an active creative window in which the brain's normal inhibitory mechanisms are relaxed and its generative capacities are operating at heightened intensity. Walker's research documented that the theta brainwave state characteristic of the hypnagogic threshold is associated with the kind of associative, pattern-connecting cognition that produces creative breakthroughs, a finding that the Hermetic tradition would recognize as a partial, materialist-framed description of the soul's access to the higher planes of creative intelligence during this window. Walker further documented that adults who consistently enter the sleep state in conditions of elevated cortisol, the stress hormone that the body produces in response to fear and anxiety, show measurable impairments in the quality of REM sleep, the sleep phase most associated with the kind of integrative, creative, cognitive processing that the mystery schools understood as the soul's primary night journey activity. Walker's clinical data, drawn from studies involving more than 10,000 research participants across multiple institutions, showed that a single night of sleep deprivation produced cognitive impairments equivalent to a blood alcohol level of 0.08%, the legal limit for driving in most jurisdictions, confirming that the pre-sleep window's management is not a peripheral spiritual concern, but a central determinant of the quality of consciousness available in the waking state. The archonic program's targeting of the pre-sleep window with fear-generating content is therefore not merely a spiritual concern. It has a specific, measurable neurobiological mechanism that modern sleep science has documented in clinical detail. The archons know this. Their program specifically targets the pre-sleep window with content designed to ensure that the mind enters the hypnagogic threshold in a state of fear, anxiety, unresolved conflict, or low-frequency, emotional agitation. The modern media landscape, with its carefully calibrated diet of alarming news, interpersonal drama, and stimulating entertainment consumed in the hours before bed, is the archonic program's primary tool for contaminating the pre-sleep mental environment and ensuring that the soul enters the night's journey in a state of energetic vulnerability rather than sovereign protection. The initiate, who has activated the principle of mentalism, uses the pre-sleep window differently. They deliberately choose the mental content they carry into the hypnagogic threshold. They direct their creative attention toward the specific outcomes they intend to generate. They hold in mind, with calm clarity and genuine feeling, the frequency of the reality they are choosing to create. This is not wishful thinking. It is the precise application of the mentalism principle to the most creatively potent window of the 24-hour cycle. The mystery schools train their initiates in specific pre-sleep practices that leverage this window with extraordinary effectiveness, and the Kybalion encodes these practices in condensed form for those who have the eyes to read them. The activation of the mentalism principle is not a one-time event. It is a continuous practice of reclaiming mental sovereignty from the archonic conditioning that has been installed across a lifetime and, according to Thoth's teaching in the Emerald Tablets, across multiple lifetimes of accumulated archonic influence. The reclamation is cumulative. Each moment of genuine sovereign mental choice, each instance of catching a conditioned thought pattern and consciously redirecting it, each deliberate choice of mental content in the pre-sleep window adds to the accumulation of sovereign frequency that progressively displaces the archonic programming. What the sleeping mind accumulated across years of unconscious creative activity, the awakening mind begins to dismantle and replace through disciplined, consistent application of the mentalism principle. What followed from this first principle would prove still more consequential. The second principle is correspondence. The Kybalion states it in 7 words: as above, so below. As below, so above. These 7 words are among the most ancient formulations in the entire Hermetic tradition. They appear in the Emerald Tablets. They appear in the Hermetica. They appear in the Gnostic texts of the 1st and 2nd centuries. They appear in the Neoplatonic philosophy of Plotinus and Iamblichus. They appear in the Sufi tradition of Ibn Arabi. They appear in the Kabbalistic tree of life as the organizing principle of the entire Sephirothic structure. No other formulation in the history of esoteric knowledge has appeared in so many different traditions across so many different centuries, because no other formulation captures a truth of such fundamental operational importance. The principle of correspondence states that the 3 planes of existence, the spiritual, the mental, and the physical, are not separate realms operating according to different laws. They are different frequencies of the same underlying reality, and what is true at one level of frequency is correspondingly true at every other level. The laws that govern the largest structures of the cosmos govern equally the smallest structures of the individual human life. The pattern that operates in the soul's deepest interior operates correspondingly in the outer circumstances of the material world. There is no gap between inner and outer. There is only the correspondence between different frequencies of the same unified field. To understand the operational significance of this principle, consider what it means for the relationship between your inner state and your outer circumstances. The Archonic program has installed the belief, so pervasive in modern consciousness that it feels like simple common sense, that outer circumstances cause inner states. You feel anxious because something threatening happened. You feel depressed because your life situation is difficult. You feel scattered and confused because the world around you is chaotic and unpredictable. This is the inverted version of the correspondence principle, the version that the Archons have substituted for the true principle in order to maintain their control over the human creative process. The true correspondence principle operates in the opposite direction. Inner states generate outer circumstances, not influence them, not partially correlate with them, but generate them through the precise mechanism that the mentalism principle describes. Because reality is fundamentally mental, and because the planes of existence are in constant correspondence with each other, any sustained state in the inner planes, which is to say, any sustained mental and emotional frequency that a soul maintains over time, will inevitably generate corresponding conditions in the outer, material plane. This is not a spiritual belief. It is the operating law of the universe, as Thoth encoded it in the Emerald Tablets, and as the Kybalion transmits it in its condensed form. The Emerald Tablets confirm the 3-plane structure of existence with extraordinary specificity. Thoth describes the spiritual plane as the plane of pure creative intelligence, the level at which the ALL's infinite mind operates in its most direct and undiluted form. He describes the mental plane as the plane of thought, imagination, and intention, the level at which individual consciousness exercises its creative function. He describes the physical plane as the plane of condensed, materialized thought, the level at which the creative outputs of the mental plane have slowed in frequency to the point of appearing solid, stable, and independent of the mind that generated them. The appearance of independence is the central illusion that the Archons maintain. Physical circumstances appear to be objective facts, independent of the observer, with their own momentum and their own causes. The correspondence principle reveals that they are not. They are materialized mental states, held in place by the sustained frequency of the consciousness that generated them. What comes next is the part that still doesn't make sense to a mind operating under archonic conditioning, and that is precisely the point. The principle of correspondence does not ask for logical acceptance. It asks for direct application. The mystery schools trained their initiates to test the principle experientially before they were asked to accept it intellectually, because the Hermetic tradition understood that intellectual acceptance without experiential evidence is not activation. It is belief, and belief is a weaker instrument than knowledge. The initiate who had tested the correspondence principle through direct application, who had deliberately shifted their inner frequency, and then observed the corresponding shift in their outer circumstances, with enough consistency and specificity to establish the causal relationship beyond reasonable doubt, that initiate possessed knowledge rather than belief. And knowledge is operationally effective in a way that belief is not. The testing protocol that the mystery schools used for the correspondence principle was precise. The initiate was instructed to identify a specific area of their outer life that was not in the state they desired, a relationship that was strained, a financial situation that was constrained, a creative project that was blocked, a health condition that was persistent. They were then instructed to identify the corresponding inner state that was generating those outer conditions. not by blaming themselves for their circumstances, which is another archonic trap, but by observing with calm, non-judgmental precision what mental and emotional frequency they were sustaining in relation to that area of life. What did they believe about it? What did they feel when they thought about it? What unconscious assumptions were they running about what was possible, what they deserved, what forces were working against them? Having identified the inner correspondence, the initiate was then instructed to work on changing it, using the mental transmutation techniques derived from the mentalism principle, and to observe what happened in the outer circumstances over a period of weeks and months. The results, documented in the records of the mystery schools that have survived the archonic purges, were consistent and specific. When the inner frequency shifted, the outer circumstances shifted correspondingly. Not always in the ways the initiate expected or predicted, because the ALL's creative intelligence operates with a wisdom that exceeds the individual mind's planning capacity. But the shift was real, measurable, and specifically correlated with the inner change. The historical record of the correspondence principle's operative confirmation extends well beyond the mystery school tradition. The Swiss psychiatrist Carl Gustav Jung, who studied the Hermetic and alchemical traditions extensively, and whose collected works include a 2-volume analysis of alchemical symbolism, published in 1944 and 1955, under the titles Psychology, Alchemy, and Mysterium Conjunctionis, developed. His concept of synchronicity specifically to account for the phenomenon that the correspondence principle describes, the non-causal but meaningful connection between inner psychological states and outer events. Jung documented hundreds of cases in his clinical practice in which a patient's inner psychological shift was accompanied by a corresponding and apparently unrelated shift in their outer circumstances, with a specificity and consistency that he found impossible to attribute to coincidence. Jung was careful to frame his findings in the language of academic psychology rather than Hermetic law, because he understood that the archonically controlled academic establishment would reject the findings if they were presented in their true Hermetic context. But the phenomenon he was documenting was precisely what the correspondence principle describes, and his documentation of it in a clinical, academically credible form represents one of the most significant 20th century confirmations of Thoth's teaching. Jung's 1952 essay, Synchronicity, and a causal connecting principle, published jointly with the physicist Wolfgang Pauli in a volume titled The Interpretation of Nature and the Psyche, extended the synchronicity concept into the domain of quantum physics, with Pauli arguing that the non-local correlations documented in quantum mechanics represented a physical confirmation of the same acausal meaningful connection that Jung had documented in the psychological domain. The Pauli-Jung collaboration, which lasted from their first meeting in 1930 until Pauli's death in 1958, represents the most rigorous 20th century attempt to bridge the Hermetic correspondence principle with the findings of modern physics, and its conclusions, while carefully framed in the language of academic science, point unmistakably toward the operative reality that the Kybalion encodes. The archons invert the correspondence principle to trap the soul in a specific and very effective loop. They ensure that the soul focuses its creative attention on the outer circumstances it does not want, which generates inner states of fear, resistance, and reactive emotion, which in turn generate more of the outer circumstances that produce those inner states. This is the mechanism behind what the popular culture calls a rut, a pattern of recurring difficulty or limitation that seems impossible to break no matter what action is taken in the outer world. The rut persists because action in the outer world, without a corresponding change in the inner frequency that is generating the outer conditions, simply produces more of the same. You can change your job, your relationship, your city, your diet, and your daily routine, and the same pattern will reassemble itself in the new context because the inner frequency that is generating it has not changed. The Kybalion's teaching on correspondence provides the exit from this loop. The exit is not in the outer world. The exit is in the inner planes. Specifically, it is in the identification and deliberate transformation of the mental and emotional frequency that corresponds to the outer pattern you are experiencing. The Hermetic alchemist who has activated the correspondence principle does not fight against outer circumstances. They work on the inner correspondence, with the calm certainty that the outer will follow, because the law of correspondence is not a preference or a tendency, it is the operating structure of reality itself. The three-plane structure that Thoth described in the Emerald Tablets gives the practitioner a precise map for this inner work. The spiritual plane corresponds to the level of the soul's deepest identity and creative intention. The mental plane corresponds to the level of thoughts, beliefs, imagination, and emotional states. The physical plane corresponds to the materialized output of the mental and spiritual planes. The practitioner works upward through the planes, beginning with the mental plane, where the most accessible work can be done, and progressively accessing the spiritual plane, where the most fundamental creative decisions are made. The inner planes mirror and govern outer events with a precision that, once directly observed, makes the archonic program's inverted version of reality impossible to maintain. The soul that has seen the correspondence operating clearly enough times, in specific enough detail, to know it as law rather than coincidence, is a soul that has broken free of the archonic loop. Not because the archons have been defeated in any external confrontation, but because the soul has reclaimed the operating principle that the archons depend on for their access. An inner state that is sovereign, clear, and aligned with the soul's genuine creative intentions is an inner state that the archons cannot redirect for their own purposes, because it is no longer generating the low-frequency output that their system requires. The Hermetic philosopher and physician Paracelsus, born Theophrastus von Hohenheim in Einsiedeln, Switzerland in 1493, and widely regarded as the founder of modern toxicology and pharmacology, applied the correspondence principle directly to the practice of medicine. Paracelsus argued that every disease of the physical body has a corresponding disturbance in the mental and spiritual planes, and that genuine healing requires addressing the correspondence at all three levels simultaneously. His medical philosophy, which was systematically suppressed by the archonically controlled academic medical establishment of his time, anticipated by 4 centuries the findings of modern psychoneuroimmunology, the field that studies the relationship between psychological states and immune function. Research published in journals including Psychosomatic Medicine and Brain, Behavior, and Immunity from the 1980s onward has documented with clinical precision that sustained states of fear, grief, and chronic stress produce measurable and specific impairments in immune function, while sustained states of positive emotional engagement produce corresponding improvements. The correspondence principle, operating in the domain of physical health, confirmed by clinical research that the researchers themselves rarely frame in Hermetic terms. A landmark 2004 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences by researchers Sheldon Cohen and colleagues at Carnegie Mellon University directly exposed 334 healthy volunteers to rhinovirus after measuring their psychological stress levels, finding that individuals with higher chronic stress scores were significantly more likely to develop clinical illness, with the correlation between psychological state and immune response holding even after controlling for age, sex, education, and baseline immune markers. Paracelsus, writing in the 1530s, had described this exact mechanism in the language of Hermetic correspondence. The Carnegie Mellon researchers described it in the language of psychoneuroimmunology. The operative reality they were both documenting was identical. Tonight, before you sleep, the application of the correspondence principle is specific and immediate. Identify the area of your life where the outer conditions are most discordant with what you genuinely intend. Sit with it, not with anxiety or urgency, but with the calm authority of a practitioner who knows the law. Ask what inner frequency corresponds to those outer conditions. Observe it without judgment. Then, deliberately and with full mental engagement, shift that inner frequency toward the state that corresponds to the outer conditions you intend to create. Hold that inner state as you move towards sleep. Let the hypnagogic threshold carry it into the deeper creative levels of the night's journey. What follows from this practice, applied consistently, will confirm the correspondence principle through direct experience, in a way that no amount of reading or listening can substitute for. What followed from this second principle would prove still more consequential. The third and fourth principles are vibration and polarity. They are presented together here because they operate as a pair, each illuminating and completing the other in a way that makes their combined teaching more operationally powerful than either principle alone. The Kybalion presents them in sequence, with vibration as the third principle and polarity as the fourth, and the logic of this sequencing is precise. Once you understand that everything vibrates, polarity tells you how to work with the spectrum of vibration to achieve the specific frequencies you intend. The vibration principle states, with the same compressed precision that characterizes all 7 Kybalion principles. Nothing rests. Everything moves. Everything vibrates. This is not a poetic observation. It is a description of the fundamental operating condition of all existence at every scale and in every plane. The Emerald Tablets record Thoth's teaching on vibration as one of the most detailed and technically precise sections of the entire corpus. Thoth described vibration not as a property that some things have and others do not, but as the defining characteristic of existence itself. To exist is to vibrate. The differences between what appears to be solid matter and what appears to be immaterial thought are not differences in kind, but differences in the rate and character of vibration. Physical matter vibrates at the lowest frequencies accessible within the material plane, frequencies so slow relative to the higher planes that they appear, to ordinary perception, to be solid and static. Light vibrates at frequencies that the physical senses can detect at the upper end of their range. Sound vibrates at frequencies that the body can perceive through multiple sensory channels. Thought vibrates at frequencies that lie above the range of ordinary physical detection, but that are nonetheless real and operative, as the mentalism principle establishes. The spiritual plane vibrates at frequencies so high relative to the physical plane that they are effectively infinite from the material perspective, and it is at these highest frequencies that the ALL's creative intelligence operates in its most direct and undiluted form. The significance of this for the awakening soul is immediate and practical. If everything vibrates, then the soul's current state, its health, its relationships, its financial circumstances, its creative capacity, its clarity of mind, is a direct expression of the vibrational frequency it is currently sustaining. And if vibrational frequency can be changed, then every aspect of the soul's experience can be changed correspondingly, through the mechanism that the correspondence principle describes. The Kybalion's teaching on vibration is therefore not merely cosmological. It is a precision instrument for understanding the relationship between the soul's inner frequency and the quality of its outer experience. The scientific confirmation of the vibration principle, while framed in materialist rather than hermetic language, is extensive and specific. The physicist Max Planck, whose 1900 discovery of the quantum of action established the foundation of quantum mechanics, demonstrated that energy is not continuous but quantized, that it exists in discrete packets of specific frequencies, and that the behavior of matter at the subatomic level is fundamentally a function of vibrational frequency rather than of solid material substance. Planck himself, in a 1944 speech in Florence, stated directly that matter as such does not exist, that all matter originates and exists only by virtue of a force that brings the particles of an atom to vibration, and that behind this force there must be a conscious and intelligent mind. This statement, made by the founder of quantum mechanics at the end of his life, is a precise formulation of the vibration principle in the language of 20th century physics. The archonically controlled academic establishment has consistently treated it as a philosophical aside rather than a scientific conclusion, because its implications, if taken seriously, would confirm the entire Hermetic framework. Planck's quantum of action, designated by the symbol h and measured at approximately 6.626 times 10 to the negative 34th joules seconds, established that the universe operates in discrete vibrational units at the most fundamental level of physical reality, a finding that the Hermetic tradition recognizes as the materialist science's inadvertent confirmation of what Thoth encoded in the Emerald Tablets millennia earlier. The archons lock humans in low-frequency loops with extraordinary efficiency. The primary mechanism is the installation of persistent negative emotional states, because emotional states are the most powerful frequency generators available to human consciousness. Fear, which the archonic program generates through the perception of threat, both real and manufactured, vibrates at a frequency that is measurably different from love, which the Kybalion and the Emerald Tablets describe as the highest frequency accessible to human consciousness within the material plane. The researcher David Hawkins, whose 1995 work, Power versus Force, presented a calibrated map of human emotional frequencies, using applied kinesiology as a measurement tool, documented a specific hierarchy of emotional vibrational states ranging from shame at the lowest level through fear, anger, pride, courage, acceptance, and reason, up to love, joy, and enlightenment at the highest levels. Hawkins' methodology has been contested by academic critics, but his mapping of the emotional frequency spectrum corresponds with extraordinary precision to the Hermetic tradition's description of the vibrational hierarchy that the Kybalion encodes. And somehow, it gets worse. Chronic fear, anxiety, resentment, and shame are not merely unpleasant. They are specific vibrational signatures that generate corresponding outer conditions through the correspondence principle, and they simultaneously make the soul more accessible to archonic parasitic attachment because the archons are calibrated to operate at those specific lower frequencies. The Japanese researcher Masaru Emoto, whose experiments conducted between 1994 and his death in 2014, documented the effect of human emotional states and spoken words on the crystalline structure of water, produced photographic evidence that water exposed to states of love, gratitude, and harmonious intention formed geometrically coherent and visually beautiful crystal structures, while water exposed to states of fear, hatred, and chaotic intention formed distorted, fragmented, and asymmetrical structures. Emoto's methodology was contested by the academic establishment, which is the expected archonic response to any research that confirms the vibration principle in a form accessible to the general public. The significance of his findings for the human body, which is composed of approximately 60% water by mass, is immediate and specific. The vibrational frequency of the emotional states you sustain is not merely a psychological phenomenon. It is a physical one, operating at the level of the molecular structure of the water that constitutes the majority of your physical form. The vibration principle, confirmed at the molecular level. The mystery schools of Egypt trained their initiates in what the Kybalion calls mental transmutation, the deliberate raising of vibrational frequency through specific mental and emotional practices. The Hermetic alchemists of the medieval and Renaissance periods encoded these same practices in the symbolic language of physical alchemy, speaking of turning lead into gold, not as a literal metallurgical operation, but as a description of the transmutation of low-frequency consciousness into high-frequency sovereignty. The lead is the soul locked in the low-frequency archonic loop. The gold is the soul that has raised its vibrational frequency through deliberate practice to the point where the archonic program can no longer maintain its grip. The process of raising vibrational frequency initially makes the contrast between the soul's genuine high-frequency nature and its current conditioned low-frequency state more painfully apparent. The initiate who begins the practice of mental transmutation does not immediately feel better. They initially feel the full weight of the archonic conditioning that has been suppressing their natural frequency, and this can feel like an intensification of difficulty rather than an alleviation of it. The mystery schools prepared their initiates for this experience explicitly, because initiates who were not prepared for it would abandon the practice at precisely the moment when it was beginning to work. The polarity principle completes the picture that vibration opens. The Kybalion states, everything is dual, everything has poles, everything has its pair of opposites. Like and unlike are the same. Opposites are identical in nature, but different in degree. This is another formulation that the archonic program has worked hard to suppress, because it contains within it the precise mechanism for mental transmutation. If opposites are identical in nature but different in degree, then the distance between any low-frequency state and its corresponding high-frequency pole is not a gap that must be crossed through external circumstances. It is a spectrum that can be traversed through deliberate internal movement. Fear and courage are not opposite things. They are the same thing at different points on the same vibrational spectrum. Poverty consciousness and abundance consciousness are not opposite realities. They are the same consciousness at different points on the same spectrum of mental frequency. Confusion and clarity are not opposite mental states. They are the same mental capacity operating at different vibrational levels. This understanding is the key to the mental transmutation that the mystery schools taught, because it means that you do not need to destroy a negative state in order to move beyond it. You need only to transmute it, to shift it along the spectrum it already occupies, toward the positive pole that is the same thing at a higher frequency. A specific detail that the Kybalion makes explicit, and that the archonic program has worked particularly hard to obscure, is that the polarity principle applies to mental states in a way that makes deliberate transmutation both possible and direct. That specific detail was a warning sign. The archons ignored it when Thoth first encoded the polarity principle in the emerald tablets. The warning was this: Any soul that learns to traverse the polarity spectrum through deliberate mental transmutation becomes progressively immune to the Archonic program's primary control mechanism, which is the installation and maintenance of low-frequency emotional states. A soul that can transmute fear into courage, shame into dignity, confusion into clarity, and scarcity consciousness into abundance. Consciousness, through deliberate internal practice, is a soul whose creative power is no longer available for Archonic redirection. The Hermetic practitioner who is experiencing a state of fear does not fight the fear, does not suppress it, does not distract themselves from it, and does not wait for external circumstances to change in order to feel safe. They apply the polarity principle directly, recognizing the fear as a low-frequency expression of the same energy that, at its high-frequency pole, is courage and sovereign certainty. They then use the specific mental transmutation techniques derived from the mentalism and correspondence principles to deliberately move their consciousness along that spectrum toward the higher pole. The reclamation of the vibrational spectrum is, in the Hermetic tradition, the practical definition of freedom. Not political freedom, not economic freedom, not social freedom, though all of these tend to follow as outer correspondences of the inner reclamation. The freedom that Thoth taught in the Egyptian mystery schools was the freedom of the soul to choose its own frequency, regardless of what the outer circumstances are generating as pressure towards specific low-frequency states. The master, in the Kybalion's language, is one who has achieved this freedom of vibrational choice. The student is one who is in the process of reclaiming it from the Archonic conditioning that has suppressed it. But this wasn't just about individual souls anymore. When a sufficient number of souls reclaim their vibrational sovereignty, the collective frequency of human consciousness shifts, and the Archonic program, which depends on the collective low-frequency field for its sustaining power, begins to lose its hold at a systemic level. The mystery schools understood this. The three initiates who published the Kybalion in 1908 understood this. The release of the transmission at that specific moment in the cosmic cycle was not an act of individual spiritual generosity. It was a strategic intervention in the larger project of collective human awakening, timed to coincide with a window when the Archonic grip was sufficiently loosened to allow a wider transmission to take hold. What followed would prove still more consequential. The fifth and sixth principles are rhythm and cause and effect. Like vibration and polarity, they operate as a complementary pair, with rhythm describing the cyclic structure of existence, and cause and effect describing the mechanism by which events unfold within that structure. Together, they give the awakening soul an extraordinarily precise map of how the universe operates across time, and more importantly, how to position oneself within that operation so as to move from being subject to its forces to being a conscious participant in directing them. The rhythm principle states, everything flows, out and in. Everything has its tides. All things rise and fall. The pendulum swing manifests in everything. The measure of the swing to the right is the measure of the swing to the left. Rhythm compensates. The Kybalion is quoting Thoth directly here. This formulation appears in the Emerald Tablets in a form that makes clear it is not a philosophical observation about natural cycles, but a precise description of a universal law that governs every level of existence, from the expansion and contraction of the cosmos itself, to the rise and fall of civilizations, to the cycles of individual human fortune, health, creative capacity, and emotional state. The rhythm principle governs sleep and waking, death and rebirth, expansion and contraction, activity and rest. Every domain of existence operates in cycles, and those cycles are not random. They follow the precise compensatory logic that the Kybalion describes. The magnitude of the swing in one direction determines the magnitude of the compensatory swing in the opposite direction. A period of intense creative output is followed by a period of rest and integration. A period of expansion is followed by a period of consolidation. A period of high emotional intensity is followed by a period of relative flatness. These rhythms are not failures or dysfunctions. They are the operating structure of existence at the level of manifestation. The Archons weaponize rhythm to drain sovereign will with a precision that the mystery schools recognized and documented. The primary Archonic application of the rhythm principle is the amplification of the downswing when the natural rhythm of a soul's experience moves into a contractive phase, a period of difficulty, reduced energy, apparent setback, or emotional heaviness. The Archonic program intensifies that experience through the installation of fear, catastrophizing, and the narrative that the downswing is permanent rather than cyclic. The soul that does not know the rhythm principle interprets the downswing as evidence that something is fundamentally wrong, that the positive experiences of the upswing were illusory, that its genuine nature is one of difficulty and limitation rather than creative sovereignty. This interpretation, which is entirely false but feels completely convincing from within the downswing, causes the soul to generate mental and emotional content that deepens and extends the downswing beyond its natural duration and magnitude. The Kybalion's teaching on rhythm provides the antidote. The initiate who has activated this principle recognizes the downswing for what it is, a phase of the cycle, not a revelation of permanent truth. They maintain their sovereign frequency during the downswing, not by denying its reality or forcing a false positivity, but by holding the knowledge that the compensatory upswing is already built into the structure of the rhythm. They do not fight the downswing. They do not collapse into it. They move through it with the calm authority of one who knows where they are in the cycle and knows that the cycle will continue to turn. There's a reason this story is still talked about today, in every tradition that has preserved any fragment of Thoth's teaching. The mystery schools of Egypt made the mastery of rhythm one of their central training objectives, because a soul that can maintain sovereign frequency during the downswing is a soul that breaks the archonic amplification mechanism. The archons cannot extend the downswing indefinitely in a soul that does not cooperate with their catastrophizing narrative. Without the soul's own fearful interpretation of the downswing as permanent disaster, the archonic program loses the mental and emotional content it needs to sustain the extension of the difficult phase. The historical record of civilizations that understood and applied the rhythm principle is specific and instructive. The ancient Egyptian calendar was organized around a precise understanding of natural rhythmic cycles, including the annual flooding of the Nile, which the Egyptians tracked with extraordinary accuracy using a network of nilometers, graduated measuring columns installed at strategic points along the river from Aswan to the delta. The oldest surviving nilometer, located on Rhoda Island in Cairo, dates to approximately 715 CE in its current form, but is built on a site that the historical record indicates was used for Nile measurement since at least the Old Kingdom period, roughly 2700 BCE. The Egyptian agricultural and ritual calendar was calibrated to these measurements with a precision that allowed the civilization to plan its food production, its religious observances, and its major construction projects in alignment with the natural rhythmic cycles that the rhythm principle describes. The civilization that understood rhythm at the level of practical agricultural management was the same civilization that encoded the rhythm principle in its mystery school tradition. The connection was not coincidental. It was the same understanding operating at different scales of application. The masters of the Hermetic tradition are described in the Kybalion as those who have learned to rise above the swing of the pendulum. This does not mean they escape the rhythm. The rhythm operates at all levels of existence, and no individual consciousness within the manifested universe is exempt from it. What the master achieves is the ability to maintain their awareness at a level above the full amplitude of the pendulum's swing, so that while the rhythm continues to operate in their experience, it does so with reduced amplitude and without the catastrophic interpretations that the archonic program installs in the unawakened soul. The master experiences the downswing, but from a perspective that maintains the larger view, the knowledge of where they are in the cycle, the certainty of the compensatory upswing, and the sovereign equanimity that comes from knowing the law. The cause and effect principle is the sixth of the seven, and it operates in direct relationship with the rhythm principle. The Kybalion states, "Every cause has its effect. Every effect has its cause. Everything happens according to law. Chance is but a name for law not recognized. There are many planes of causation, but nothing escapes the law." This principle is perhaps the most operationally significant of the seven for the soul that is in the process of reclaiming its sovereignty, because it addresses directly the question of agency. Who or what is generating the events and circumstances of your life? The archonic program's answer to this question is one of two equally disempowering options. The first option is pure materialism. Your circumstances are the result of physical causes, genetic inheritance, economic forces, social structures, and random chance, and you are subject to these causes, with limited ability to influence them. The second option is moral fatalism. Your circumstances are the result of divine judgment, karmic punishment, or supernatural forces beyond your control, and your role is acceptance and submission. Both options locate the primary causes of your experience outside yourself and outside your sphere of influence. Both options are archonic installations designed to ensure that the soul never discovers the actual mechanism of causation that the Kybalion describes. The actual cause and effect principle operates on multiple planes simultaneously, and the key to sovereignty is understanding which plane you are operating on. At the lowest plane, the plane of ordinary material causation, events appear to cause other events through physical mechanisms, and the individual appears to be subject to these causal chains with limited power to intervene. This is the plane on which the archonic program keeps the sleeping soul's attention fixed. At higher planes, the causal relationships are different. Mental causes generate mental effects, which then generate physical effects through the correspondence mechanism. Spiritual causes generate effects that ripple down through the mental and physical planes with even greater power and scope. The Hermetic master who operates from the higher planes of causation is not subject to the lower plane causal chains in the same way that a soul locked at the lower plane is, because the higher plane causes override and redirect the lower plane effects. No accident exists, no chance event occurs, no random misfortune strikes without cause. This is the teaching of the cause and effect principle, and it is one that the archonic program has worked hard to obscure, because a soul that understands that everything in its experience has a cause is a soul that will seek to understand those causes, and a soul that understands the causes will discover that many of them are located in its own mental and emotional patterns, which means they can be changed. The archons prefer the soul to believe in chance, because chance is the experience of law not recognized, and a soul that attributes its circumstances to chance will not look for the mental and emotional causes that are actually generating them. The philosopher and mathematician Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who lived from 1646 to 1716 and who independently developed calculus at the same time as Isaac Newton, formulated what he called the principle of sufficient reason, the philosophical proposition that nothing happens without a reason sufficient to determine why it happens as it does, rather than otherwise. Leibniz arrived at this formulation through pure philosophical reasoning, without access to the Hermetic tradition's full framework, but his principle of sufficient reason is a precise philosophical statement of the cause and effect principle as the Kybalion encodes it. Leibniz's formulation was subsequently incorporated into the German idealist philosophical tradition through Kant and Hegel, and from there into the broader Western intellectual tradition, where it has operated as a persistent, if rarely acknowledged, confirmation of the Hermetic teaching on causation. Leibniz's 1714 work, The Monadology, which described the universe as composed of irreducible units of consciousness called monads, each reflecting the entire universe from its own unique perspective and operating according to a pre-established harmony that Leibniz attributed to the supreme intelligence, maps with striking precision onto the Kybalion's description of individual consciousness as a specific expression of the All's infinite mind, operating in correspondence with every other expression of that mind through the universal law of correspondence. The initiate of the mystery schools, who had activated the cause and effect principle, was trained to trace the causal chain of any circumstance in their life backward through the planes, from the physical effect back through the mental causes that generated it, and back further to the spiritual intentions or the unconscious soul-level decisions that had set the mental causes in motion. This tracing practice is not an exercise in self-blame. It is an exercise in self-knowledge, because you cannot change a cause you have not identified, and you cannot identify a cause you have not looked for. The Kybalion describes the masters of Hermetic law as those who have stepped onto the higher plane of causation, which is not a mystical achievement requiring decades of monastery training. It is a practical shift in the level from which a soul consistently operates. From the reactive, effect-level plane where the archonic program keeps the sleeping soul, to the proactive, cause-level plane where the awakening soul consciously directs its creative power. Tonight, the step onto the higher plane of causation is available to you. The practice is specific. Before you sleep, trace the causal chain of one circumstance in your life that you wish to change. Identify the mental cause. Identify the deeper intention or unconscious assumption behind the mental cause. Then, using the transmutation techniques of the mentalism and polarity principles, consciously redirect that cause toward the effect you intend. This is not a ritual. It is the direct application of universal law, as Thoth encoded it and as the Kybalion transmits it. What followed from this sixth principle would prove still more consequential. The seventh and final principle is gender, and the teaching on gender, combined with the Kybalion's complete framework for mental transmutation, represents the culmination of Thoth's entire transmission through the mystery school lineages into the 1908 text. The gender principle is the most misunderstood of the seven, the most deliberately obscured by the Archonic program, and the most operationally powerful when correctly activated. The Kybalion states, "Gender is in everything. Everything has its masculine and feminine principles. Gender manifests on all planes. This is not a statement about biological sex or social gender categories. It is a description of the two fundamental creative poles that operate in all existence, at every level of the three planes. The masculine principle, as the Kybalion defines it, is the directive, projective, initiating pole of creative consciousness. It is the principle of will, intention, focus, and directed mental energy. The feminine principle is the receptive, generative, gestating pole of creative consciousness. It is the principle of imagination, feeling, intuitive knowledge, and the creative matrix in which directed mental energy takes form. Both principles are present in every individual consciousness, regardless of the biological sex of the body that consciousness inhabits. The fully activated human being is one who has developed and integrated both poles within their own consciousness, achieving what the Hermetic tradition calls the inner marriage, the sacred union of the masculine and feminine creative principles within a single sovereign mind. The Archonic program suppresses this understanding with particular aggression, because the integrated activation of both creative poles within a single consciousness produces a quality of creative power that is, from the Archonic perspective, extremely dangerous. A consciousness that combines the masculine principle's directed will with the feminine principle's generative imagination is a consciousness that can produce sustained, intentional creation at a level that the Archonic program cannot easily redirect or harvest. The Archons have therefore worked consistently across centuries and cultures to ensure that human beings identify strongly with one pole and suppress the other, so that the full creative circuit is never completed. In cultures dominated by masculine principle values, the feminine principle, which includes intuition, receptivity, emotional intelligence, and imaginative capacity, is systematically devalued, pathologized, or associated with weakness. In cultures that have swung toward a compensatory emphasis on feminine principle values, the masculine principle, which includes directed will, focused intention, and disciplined mental action, is similarly devalued or associated with aggression and domination. Both cultural patterns serve the Archonic program equally well, because both ensure that the full creative circuit remains incomplete in the majority of individual consciousnesses. Thoth confirmed in the Emerald Tablets that the mind is the philosopher's stone. This is the central revelation of the entire Hermetic alchemical tradition, encoded in the symbolic language of physical transformation but always pointing to the inner reality. The transformation of consciousness through the integration of its masculine and feminine creative poles is the true alchemy, the process by which is the divided, incomplete, archonically conditioned consciousness becomes gold, which is the integrated, sovereign, fully creative consciousness. No external substance is involved, no physical laboratory is required. The philosopher's stone is the awakened, integrated human mind, and every individual human being possesses it in potential, waiting to be activated. Mental transmutation is the real hidden alchemy that the mystery schools taught through the symbolic language of physical transformation. The Kybalion devotes significant attention to this practice, describing it as the study and use of the mental art of which all the ancient alchemists had knowledge of, and which constituted the real Hermetic art. The mental alchemist is one who has learned to apply the seven principles in integrated sequence to the contents of their own consciousness, transmuting low-frequency states into high-frequency states, incomplete creative patterns into fully integrated sovereign creative power, archonically conditioned reactions into genuinely chosen responses. The historical record of the Hermetic alchemical tradition confirms that the greatest practitioners of the art understood the gender principle as the key to the transmutation process. Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa von Netzsheim, born in Cologne in 1486, and widely regarded as the most comprehensive systematizer of Renaissance Hermetic philosophy, devoted significant sections of his three-volume De Occulta Philosophia, first published in full in 1531, to the relationship between the masculine and feminine creative principles, and their role in the alchemical transformation of consciousness. Agrippa's work synthesized the Hermetic, Neoplatonic, and Kabbalistic traditions into a single unified framework that positioned the integration of the masculine and feminine creative poles as the central operative principle of all genuine magical and spiritual practice. The work was immediately placed on the Catholic Church's Index of Forbidden Books, a designation that the Hermetic tradition recognizes as one of the most reliable indicators that a text contains genuine operative knowledge that the archonic institutional program considers dangerous. Agrippa's influence extended directly to the generation of Hermetic practitioners who produced the Rosicrucian manifestos of 1614 and 1615, with the Fama Fraternitatis drawing explicitly on the three-volume structure of De Occulta Philosophia in its description of the Invisible College's knowledge base, establishing a direct lineage from Agrippa's 1531 synthesis through the Rosicrucian transmission to the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, and ultimately to the Three Initiates' 1908 publication. The alchemist and physician Michael Meyer, born in Rendsburg in the Duchy of Holstein in 1568, and later appointed personal physician to Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II in Prague, produced in 1617 a work called Atalanta Fugiens, which combined 50 alchemical emblems with musical canons and explanatory text in a multimedia format that was, for its time, entirely without precedent. Each emblem depicted a stage of the alchemical process in symbolic imagery, and each musical canon was composed to encode the same stage in sound so that the initiate could receive the teaching simultaneously through visual and auditory channels. Meyer's explicit purpose was to engage both the masculine principle through the directed analytical attention required to decode the emblematic imagery, and the feminine principle through the receptive, feeling-based engagement that music activates. In the same act of contemplation, the Atalanta Fugiens is therefore not merely an alchemical text. It is a practical device for activating the gender principle's integration within the consciousness of the reader, designed by a practitioner who understood the operative mechanism with extraordinary precision. The integration of the masculine and feminine creative principles is the final stage of the transmutation process. The masculine principle, operating without the feminine, produces mental rigidity, obsessive control, creative sterility, and a quality of will that is forceful but ultimately self-defeating because it has no generative matrix to work with. The feminine principle, operating without the masculine, produces diffuse, creative energy, imaginative richness without directed manifestation, emotional depth without the focused intention needed to translate feeling into form. The archons exploit both of these imbalances, using the masculine without feminine pattern to generate the experience of effortful struggle that produces nothing, and using the feminine without masculine pattern to generate the experience of rich inner life that never finds expression in the outer world. The activation of both poles within a single consciousness is not a complex or distant achievement. The Kybalion describes it as a practice that can begin in any moment, through the deliberate engagement of both creative principles in the same act of consciousness. The masculine principle is engaged through the deliberate formation of a clear, specific intention held with focused will. The feminine principle is engaged through the imaginative generation of the feeling, the full sensory and emotional experience of that intention already fulfilled. When both are engaged simultaneously, the creative circuit is complete and the manifestation process operates at its full capacity, unimpeded by the archonic interference that targets incomplete circuits. The mystery school training protocol for the gender principle was one of the most elaborate of the seven, because the integration of the two creative poles requires both intellectual understanding and direct experiential activation. The initiates of the Egyptian mystery schools underwent specific practices designed to develop each pole independently before the integration was attempted. The masculine principle was developed through disciplines of focused attention, deliberate will, precise intention formation, and sustained mental direction. The feminine principle was developed through disciplines of deep receptivity, imaginative expansion, emotional attunement, and the cultivation of the intuitive faculty that the Hermetic tradition associates with the higher levels of the mental plane. The archons suppress transmutation to keep souls inert, which is why the history of the mystery schools is also a history of persecution. Every institution that taught the integration of the creative poles, from the Pythagorean schools of ancient Greece, to the Gnostic communities of early Christianity, to the Cathar communities of medieval southern France, to the Hermetic academies of the Renaissance, was eventually targeted for suppression by the archonically controlled institutions of its time. The Cathars, who flourished in the Languedoc region of southern France, between approximately 1000 and 1250 CE, and who preserved a version of the Gnostic and Hermetic teaching on the masculine and feminine creative principles in their Theology of the Divine Masculine and Divine Feminine, were subjected to the Albigensian Crusade, launched by Pope Innocent III in 1209, a military campaign that resulted in the massacre of an estimated 200,000 people and the near-total destruction of the Cathar communities within 40 years. The suppressions were never framed in terms of their actual motivation, which was the prevention of the widespread activation of sovereign creative consciousness. They were always framed in the language of the dominant cultural authority of the time: heresy, subversion, dangerous ideas, threats to social order. The language changed across the centuries. The underlying motivation did not. The Kybalion survived these suppressions because it was not attached to an institution. It was carried in minds, transmitted mouth to ear, encoded in the symbolic languages of alchemy and Kabbalah and Rosicrucianism, and finally committed to print in 1908, in a form that was deliberately designed to be both accessible to the ready soul and impenetrable to the casual or hostile reader. The 7 principles, presented in the Kybalion's compressed and systematic form, contain everything needed to begin the activation process. The activation itself, the direct, experiential, lived integration of the principles into sovereign creative consciousness, is the work that each individual soul must do for itself, guided by the principles but not substituted for by them. One additional confirmation of the gender principle's operative power comes from the Taoist tradition of ancient China, which developed entirely independently of the Egyptian mystery school lineage, yet arrived at a formulation that maps with striking precision onto the Kybalion's 7th principle. The Taoist concepts of yin and yang, documented in texts including the I Ching, whose oldest layers date to approximately 1000 BCE, and the Tao Te Ching, attributed to Lao Tzu and dated to the 6th century BCE, describe the same 2 fundamental creative poles that the Kybalion identifies as the masculine and feminine principles. Yang corresponds to the directive, projective, initiating quality of the masculine principle. Yin corresponds to the receptive, generative, gestating quality of the feminine principle. The Taoist teaching, like the Hermetic teaching, insists that neither pole is superior to the other, that the dynamic interplay of both is the source of all creation, and that the sage, which is the Taoist equivalent of the Hermetic master, is one who has achieved the inner integration of both poles in a state of dynamic, creative balance. The fact that 2 entirely separate civilizations, separated by thousands of miles and operating in different cultural and linguistic contexts, arrived at the same operative understanding of the 2 fundamental creative poles of consciousness is not a coincidence. It is the correspondence principle operating at the level of civilizational wisdom. The same inner law, recognized independently, expressing itself in different symbolic languages, but pointing to the same operative reality. The Taoist philosopher Zhuangzi, writing in the 4th century BCE in a collection of texts now known as the Zhuangzi, described the integrated sage as one who moves through the world without friction, whose actions arise from the spontaneous interplay of yin and yang within a unified consciousness, and who therefore accomplishes without forcing, creates without striving, and generates without effort. This description maps precisely onto the Kybalion's description of the Hermetic master who has completed the inner marriage of the masculine and feminine creative principles, and its appearance in a tradition entirely independent of the Egyptian mystery school lineage confirms that the gender principle is not a cultural artifact of any particular civilization, but a universal law of consciousness that any sufficiently advanced tradition will eventually discover. Activate both poles within tonight. Before you sleep, form a clear, specific intention using the full focus of your masculine creative principle. Then generate the feeling, the full imaginative and emotional experience of that intention fulfilled, using the full receptive capacity of your feminine creative principle. Hold both simultaneously. Let the integrated creative circuit be the last conscious act of your waking mind as you move towards sleep. The night's journey will carry that integrated creative signal into the deeper planes of the soul's activity, where its generative power is multiplied by the absence of the archonically conditioned waking mind's interference. What follows from this seventh and final principle, when activated in integration with the six that precede it, is the complete Hermetic transmission as Thoth encoded it. What followed would prove still more consequential. The Egyptian mystery schools did not arise spontaneously. They were established by Thoth as deliberate institutions for the preservation and transmission of the seven principles, designed with the specific understanding that the archonic forces would eventually infiltrate and corrupt any institution that operated openly. The earliest mystery schools of ancient Egypt, those associated with the temples of Memphis in the Old Kingdom period, roughly 2700 to 2200 BCE, operated at the intersection of priestly and royal authority. The pharaoh was understood not as a political ruler in the modern sense, but as the primary initiated consciousness of the civilization, the soul most fully aligned with the principles of the ALL's creative intelligence, and therefore most capable of directing the collective creative power of the Egyptian people toward outcomes that served the civilization's highest purpose. The training of the pharaoh and the senior priesthood in the seven principles was the central function of the mystery schools in this earliest period. The initiates were trained in Memphis, at the temple complex of Ptah, who was understood in the Memphite theology as the divine craftsman, the creative intelligence that brought all things into existence through the power of the spoken word, which is to say, through the power of directed mental intention operating through the medium of sound vibration. The Memphite theology is, in its essence, a formulation of the mentalism and vibration principles in the symbolic language of ancient Egyptian religious thought. Ptah's creative act of speaking the world into existence is a description of the Ol's infinite mind, generating reality through the vibration of directed intention. From Memphis, the mystery school tradition expanded through the Old and Middle Kingdom periods to include the temples of Heliopolis, which was the center of the solar theology associated with Ra and the Ennead, the 9 primordial principles of creation. The Heliopolitan system mapped the structure of the cosmos in terms that corresponded precisely to the 7 principles of the Kybalion, using the symbolic language of divine genealogy to describe the relationships between the fundamental laws of existence. Ra, as the supreme creative intelligence, corresponded to the all of the mentalism principle. The Ennead, as the 9 creative principles that emanated from Ra, corresponded to the 7 principles of the Kybalion, plus the 2 meta-principles of the masculine and feminine creative poles. The correspondence was not accidental. It was the same teaching in a different symbolic language, designed for a different level of initiate. The initiates of the Egyptian mystery schools underwent trials that were specifically designed to unlock each of the 7 principles through direct experiential activation rather than intellectual instruction. The trials were organized in a sequence that followed the logical progression of the principles themselves, beginning with the mentalism principle and moving through correspondence, vibration, polarity, rhythm, cause and effect, and gender in that order. Each trial was calibrated to produce a specific experiential crisis that could only be resolved by the activation of the corresponding principle. The initiate, who had truly activated the principle through the crisis of the trial, carried knowledge, not belief, forward into the next stage of training. The trial for the mentalism principle, for example, involved extended periods of isolation in complete darkness, often in the underground chambers beneath the great temples, where the initiate was stripped of all external sensory input and forced to confront the contents of their own mind without distraction or relief. The archonic conditioning that the ordinary mind runs on autopilot becomes visible with extraordinary clarity in conditions of complete sensory deprivation. The initiate experienced the full weight of the conditioned mental content, the fear, the reactive patterns, the archonically installed narratives about their own worthlessness or powerlessness, without any external stimulus to blame those states on. This was the designed crisis. The resolution was the recognition, forced by the absence of any alternative, that the mental content was not reality itself, but a generated construct, that the mind generating it had the capacity to generate different content, and that the choice of mental content was, ultimately, sovereign. The trial for the vibration principle involved extended exposure to specific sound frequencies, produced by the mystery school's trained musicians using instruments calibrated to specific vibrational signatures. The initiate was immersed in these frequencies for periods ranging from hours to days, experiencing directly the effect of sustained vibrational input on their mental, emotional, and physical states. The trial was designed to produce undeniable, first-person evidence that vibrational frequency determines experiential state, not the reverse. The initiate, who had experienced this directly, who had felt their own consciousness shift in response to sustained vibrational input in ways that were specific, reproducible, and independent of their intellectual interpretation, carried the vibration principle as knowledge. The architectural evidence for these initiatic practices is preserved in the physical structure of the Egyptian temples themselves. The Serapeum at Saqqara, a vast underground complex of granite chambers carved into the bedrock beneath the Saqqara Plateau and used from at least the New Kingdom period, roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE, through the Ptolemaic period, contains chambers whose acoustic properties have been documented by modern researchers as producing specific, resonant frequencies when sound is introduced. The researcher John Stuart Reid, who conducted acoustic measurements in the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid at Giza in 1997, documented that the chamber produces a standing wave resonance at approximately 121 Hz when sound is introduced, a frequency that corresponds to the theta brainwave range associated with the hypnagogic state and with the kind of heightened creative and intuitive awareness that the mystery school training protocols were designed to induce. The architectural precision required to produce this acoustic effect was not accidental. It was the physical expression of the vibration principle applied to the design of initiatic space. Reid's subsequent research, published in the journal Acoustics in 2001, extended his measurements to include the antechamber and the Queen's Chamber of the Great Pyramid, finding that each chamber produced a distinct, resonant frequency profile, with the antechamber resonating at approximately 110 Hz and the Queen's Chamber at approximately 90 Hz, suggesting a deliberate acoustic progression designed to guide the initiate through a sequence of brainwave states corresponding to the progressive activation of the 7 principles. The temple complex at Karnak, constructed and expanded across a period of more than 2,000 years, from approximately 2055 BCE through the Ptolemaic period, contains within its inner sanctuaries a series of chambers whose orientation was calculated with astronomical precision to admit specific qualities of light at specific times of year. The French Egyptologist Gaston Maspero, who served as Director General of the Egyptian Antiquities Service from 1881 to 1886, and again from 1899 to 1914, documented in his survey of the Karnak complex that the inner sanctuary of the Temple of Amun was aligned to admit the light of the rising sun at the winter solstice directly along the temple's central axis, illuminating the sanctuary's innermost chamber with a precision that required centuries of astronomical observation and architectural planning to achieve. This alignment was not decorative. It was functional, designed to produce a specific quality of light at a specific moment in the annual rhythm, for use in the initiatic practices that the mystery school conducted in that chamber at that time of year. The rhythm principle, encoded in stone and light, operating across millennia, Hermes Trismegistus named the suppressors directly in the Hermetic texts that survive from the Alexandrian period. The Asclepius, one of the most important texts in the Hermetic corpus, contains a remarkable passage in which Hermes warns his disciple Asclepius that the time will come when the sacred knowledge of Egypt will be forgotten, when foreigners will occupy the land, when the temples will be closed and the gods will depart, and when humanity will be left in a state of spiritual darkness from which it will only slowly and painfully recover. This passage, written in the Ptolemaic period sometime between 100 BCE and 200 CE, reads as a precise description of what happened to the Egyptian mystery school tradition in the centuries that followed. The Roman conquest, the Christianization of the empire under Constantine in the 4th century CE, the closure of the pagan temples by the Emperor Theodosius in 391 CE, the burning of the Library of Alexandria in the same period, and the systematic destruction of the mystery school tradition by the institutional church. The archons infiltrated institutions to bury the teaching through a process that the mystery school initiates, understood, and documented. The infiltration did not begin with direct opposition. It began with co-optation. The early Christian church incorporated significant elements of Hermetic and Gnostic symbolism and cosmology into its own developing theology, not because the early church fathers were secretly Hermetic initiates, but because these elements resonated with the awakening souls who were the primary audience for the early Christian message. The co-optation served the archonic purpose by absorbing the living transmission into an institutional framework that could then be controlled, and by gradually redefining the key concepts of the Hermetic tradition in ways that stripped them of their operative power and replaced it with passive faith and institutional dependence. The Gnostic communities of the 1st and 2nd centuries, who preserved the most complete version of the Hermetic teaching in the Christian context, were systematically targeted for destruction by the developing Orthodox Church from the late 2nd century onward. Irenaeus of Lyon, writing around 180 CE, produced a 5-volume work entitled Against Heresies that was specifically designed to discredit the Gnostic teachings and provide the institutional church with the arguments needed to justify the suppression of the Gnostic communities. By the 4th century, with the Church's alliance with imperial Roman power under Constantine, the suppression had become sufficiently complete that the Gnostic texts were largely destroyed, with only scattered fragments surviving until the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library in Upper Egypt in December 1945, when a local farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman unearthed a sealed earthenware jar containing 13 leather-bound papyrus codices near the town of Nag Hammadi, restoring to the modern world 52 Gnostic texts that the archonic institutional program had sought to eliminate for 16 centuries. The Nag Hammadi texts, which were translated into English and published in a scholarly edition by James M. Robinson in 1977 under the title The Nag Hammadi Library, included the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Apocryphon of John, and the Tripartite Tractate, each of which preserved significant elements of the Hermetic teaching on the nature of consciousness, the structure of the cosmos, and the soul's path of return to its divine source in a form that the archonic institutional program had believed permanently destroyed. The Kybalion reached 1908 because Thoth willed it. The Emerald Tablets describe a specific mechanism by which Thoth's preserved intelligence continues to operate in the world, directing the timing and form of the transmission's resurgence at each stage of the larger cosmic cycle. The intelligence that Thoth encoded in the tablets is not a static archive. It is a living, active intelligence that monitors the collective frequency of human consciousness and determines the optimal moments for the transmission to resurface in a form that will be most effective. The 1908 publication was one such moment. The current moment, in which you are receiving this transmission through this channel, is another. The mystery schools that survived the archonic purges of the ancient and medieval periods preserve not only the intellectual content of the 7 principles, but the initiatic technology, the specific practices, trials, and experiential activation protocols that made the principles operationally effective rather than merely intellectually interesting. These schools operated in the margins of the dominant culture, concealed within the symbolic languages of alchemy, Kabbalah, Rosicrucianism, and Freemasonry, visible only to those who had the eyes to see them. The 3 initiates, who published the Kybalion in 1908, were the heirs of this preserved tradition, and their decision to commit the 7 principles to a publicly accessible printed text was a calculated act of Hermetic generosity, undertaken with the full understanding that the archonic program would attempt to discredit, marginalize, and ultimately bury the text, as it had buried every previous public expression of the transmission. The attempt has not succeeded. The Kybalion remains in print. It has been translated into dozens of languages. It has found its way into the hands and minds and souls of an increasing number of awakening individuals who are applying the 7 principles directly and experiencing the results that direct application produces. The archonic program's preferred response to this persistence has been to categorize the Kybalion as a minor historical curiosity, a product of its time with no genuine ancient lineage, a new thought pamphlet dressed up in Hermetic language. This categorization is designed to drain the text of its operative power by encouraging readers to approach it as a historical artifact rather than a living transmission. For those who are ready, the categorization fails. The transmission activates regardless of what the academic consensus says about its provenance. What followed from the mystery school's long preservation of this teaching would prove still more consequential. Sleep is the sacred battleground of the soul. This was established in the Egyptian mystery schools as one of the most fundamental recognitions of the initiatic tradition, and it is the recognition that the Kybalion's 7 principles, when applied specifically to the pre-sleep window and the sleep state itself, become most immediately and powerfully operative. Thoth's teaching in the Emerald Tablets is explicit on this point. The hours of sleep are not a passive biological process during which consciousness is temporarily suspended. They are a period of heightened soul activity, during which the individual consciousness moves through multiple planes of existence, encounters forces that are not accessible to ordinary waking awareness, and engages in creative processes that determine, in significant measure, the quality of the waking experience that follows. The Archons harvest energy during unprotected sleep. This is stated as established fact in the Hermetic tradition, confirmed in the Emerald Tablets, and preserved in the initiatic knowledge of every mystery school lineage that has survived to the present. The mechanism is specific. During the transition from waking to sleeping consciousness, the soul's protective frequency, which is maintained during the waking state through the engagement of the will and the directed attention, begins to relax. In an unawakened soul, this relaxation is complete and unmanaged. The soul enters the sleep state in whatever vibrational condition the waking day has left it, which, for a soul operating under archonic conditioning in the modern world, typically means a condition of energetic depletion, low-frequency emotional residue, and significant archonic parasitic attachment accumulated through the day's exposures to the archonic program's various delivery mechanisms. In this condition of unprotected relaxation, the soul is accessible to archonic interference at a level that is not possible during the waking state. The archons attach to the energetic field of the sleeping soul and extract the vital frequency that the soul generates through its creative processes. The extraction produces specific, measurable effects in the waking state: persistent fatigue that does not resolve through sleep, a sense of heaviness or depletion upon waking, recurring nightmares or disturbing dream content, and a gradual erosion of the creative and cognitive clarity that are the natural expression of the sovereign soul. These effects are so common in the modern world that they have been normalized, attributed to stress, poor diet, insufficient exercise, and the general demands of contemporary life. The Hermetic tradition names them for what they actually are: the signature of archonic energy extraction during unprotected sleep. Now, the soul could have stopped there, accepting the archonic intrusion as an inevitable feature of the sleeping state, finding ways to manage its effects in the waking world. They didn't. The mystery schools of Egypt developed a complete system for the protection and sovereign use of the sleep state, drawing on all 7 principles of the Kybalion in an integrated application, specifically calibrated for the pre-sleep window and the night's journey. This system is what the Emerald Tablets refer to as the Sovereign Seal, the establishment of a specific vibrational field around the soul's energetic body before sleep that prevents archonic attachment and allows the soul to move through the night's journey in a state of protected creative activity rather than energetic vulnerability. The Sovereign Seal is not a ritual in the conventional religious sense. It is not a prayer, not an invocation of external supernatural protection, and not a passive request for divine intervention. It is the active application of the 7 principles to the soul's own energetic field, establishing a frequency of sovereign creative consciousness that the archonic parasites cannot penetrate because they are calibrated to operate at lower frequencies. The Kybalion's 7 principles, when applied in the specific sequence and manner that the mystery schools developed for this purpose, generate a cumulative vibrational field that functions precisely as a seal. It closes the soul's energetic boundaries to archonic intrusion, while simultaneously opening the soul's access to the higher planes of creative activity that the sleep state makes available. The pineal gateway activates during the deep night hours, and this activation is both the primary target of archonic interference and the primary vehicle of sovereign soul activity during sleep. The pineal gland, located at the geometric center of the brain, is the physical correlate of what the Hermetic tradition calls the third eye, the organ of inner perception through which the soul accesses the higher planes of existence. The mystery schools of Egypt understood the pineal gateway with extraordinary precision. The architectural design of the great temples, including the specific orientation of chambers and the calculated use of light at specific times of year, was designed in part to activate the pineal gateway in initiates who were undergoing specific stages of training. The pineal gland produces melatonin, the hormone that regulates the sleep-wake cycle, and also produces trace amounts of dimethyltryptamine, a compound that the neuroscientist Rick Strassman, in his 1990 to 1995 clinical research at the University of New Mexico, documented as producing profound alterations in consciousness that research participants consistently described in terms of contact with non-physical intelligences, access to higher planes of awareness, and experiences of fundamental reality that transcended ordinary material perception. Strassman's research, published in his 2001 book, DMT, The Spirit Molecule, represents the most rigorous clinical documentation to date of the pineal gateway's function as the Hermetic tradition describes it. The Archonic program has worked consistently to suppress knowledge of the pineal gateway and to impair its function in the general population through specific environmental inputs that the Hermetic tradition documents and that modern research has confirmed produce calcification of the pineal gland, including fluoride compounds introduced into municipal water supplies at concentrations that the National Toxicology Program's 2024 systematic review found to be associated with measurable reductions in cognitive function in children. Strassman's clinical trials, which involved 60 volunteers receiving intravenous doses of dimethyltryptamine at the University of New Mexico Hospital between 1,990 and 1,995, produced a dataset of 400 individual sessions that Strassman analyzed in terms of the specific content of participants' altered states, finding that approximately half of all sessions involved what participants described as encounters with autonomous non-physical entities, a finding that Strassman himself acknowledged, mapped with disturbing precision onto the Hermetic tradition's description of the non-physical intelligences that the soul encounters during the sleep state when the pineal gateway is functioning at its full capacity. If you're wondering how that's even legal, so is everyone else who has encountered the evidence of the Archonic program's systematic suppression of the pineal gateway. The answer is that the suppression operates below the threshold of what the archonically controlled institutional systems recognize as a harm requiring intervention. The damage is real, the mechanism is specific. The Hermetic tradition has documented it for millennia, and the remedy is available in the precise application of the 7 principles to the pre-sleep window and the sleep state itself. The application of the mentalism principle to the sleep state begins with the deliberate management of mental content in the hours before sleep. The awakening soul removes itself from the Archonic program's primary pre-sleep delivery mechanisms, which include news media, social media, dramatic entertainment, and any other content designed to maintain the waking mind in a state of reactive, low-frequency engagement. In place of this content, the initiate deliberately cultivates a mental environment of calm, sovereign frequency, using the contemplative practices derived from the mentalism principle to ensure that the mind approaching the hypnagogic threshold is carrying the vibrational signature of the reality it intends to create, rather than the reality the Archonic program has been installing throughout the day. The application of the correspondence principle to the sleep state involves the deliberate alignment of the inner frequency in the pre-sleep window with the outer conditions the soul intends to generate. The initiate identifies the specific correspondence between their current inner state and their current outer circumstances, as described in the section on correspondence, and then deliberately shifts the inner frequency toward the state that corresponds to the intended outer conditions. This shift, carried into the sleep state, operates at the deeper creative levels of the soul's night journey with amplified power because the sleeping consciousness is not subject to the archonically conditioned waking mind's habitual resistance to change. The application of the vibration and polarity principles to the sleep state involves the deliberate raising of the soul's vibrational frequency in the pre-sleep window to the point where archonic parasitic attachment is not possible. The archons are calibrated to frequencies of fear, anxiety, shame, resentment, and low-level dissatisfaction. A soul that enters the sleep state, vibrating at the frequencies of sovereign creative clarity, genuine gratitude, compassionate equanimity, and aligned intentional purpose, is a soul that the Archonic program cannot attach to because the frequency differential is too great. The transmutation practices of the vibration and polarity principles, applied consistently in the pre-sleep window, create exactly this frequency differential. The rhythm principle applied to the sleep state means recognizing sleep itself as the downswing of the daily cycle, the contractive phase that makes the next day's expansive upswing possible. The initiate who understands this does not resist sleep, does not fight the contractive pull of the night, and does not carry the day's unresolved tensions into the threshold as unfinished business demanding resolution. They release the day's content deliberately. using the rhythm principle's understanding that the downswing is not a defeat, but a necessary phase of the cycle, and that the quality of the release determines the quality of the upswing that follows. The cause and effect principle applied to the sleep state means understanding that the mental and emotional content you carry into the hypnagogic threshold is a cause that will generate specific effects in the days that follow. The initiate who has activated this principle does not enter sleep passively. They enter it as a deliberate causal agent, choosing the mental content they are planting in the night's creative soil with the same precision that a skilled farmer chooses the seeds they plant in prepared ground. The gender principle applied to the sleep state is the most powerful of the 7 applications, because the sleep state itself is the domain of the feminine creative principle. The waking state is the domain of the masculine principle, directed will, focused attention, deliberate action in the outer world. The sleeping state is the domain of the feminine principle, receptive, generative, gestating. The creative matrix in which the masculine principle's directed intentions take form. The initiate who enters sleep having clearly formed their masculine principle intention, and who then surrenders that intention into the feminine principle receptivity of the sleep state, is completing the gender principle's creative circuit at the most fundamental level of the daily cycle. The night becomes a laboratory of sovereign creation, operating below the threshold of the archonically conditioned waking mind's interference, generating the forms that will materialize in the waking world as the days and weeks unfold. The 7 principles form a protective sovereign seal when applied in integrated sequence in the pre-sleep window. This is not a metaphor for a good bedtime routine. It is the precise application of Hermetic law to the most vulnerable and most creatively potent period of the soul's daily cycle. The mystery schools of Egypt developed these applications over centuries of direct, experiential research by initiated practitioners who had access to the full 7-principle framework and the specific activation protocols that made each principle operationally effective. The Kybalion transmits these applications in compressed form for those who have the eyes to read them. For a while, things actually seemed fine. The Archonic program appeared to have successfully contained the transmission within the margins of popular culture, categorized it as New Age entertainment rather than operative Hermetic law. That didn't last. The transmission's reach has expanded beyond anything the Archonic program anticipated, finding its way into the hands and minds and souls of an increasing number of awakening individuals who are applying the 7 principles directly and experiencing the results that direct application produces. The Archonic program's containment strategy is failing, not because of any external confrontation, but because the transmission itself, as Thoth designed it, is self-activating in the souls that are ready to receive it. Apply the Kybalion tonight. Reclaim your frequency. The seal is already forming around you. You are the mystery school now. Remember, the Kybalion was published in 1908 without an author's name, without a publisher's reputation, without any institutional endorsement, and it still found every soul that was ready to receive it across more than a century of active suppression. That is what a living transmission does. Subscribe and join the others who are applying these principles tonight.